The splendid piano quartet we're about to hear dates from June 1786, about 8 months after the completion of Mozart's first essay in that genre. This may seem curious to some, but I tend to regard this E-flat major work as a more serious composition than its G-minor companion. It is, overall, a much more consistent work, both in terms of key tonality and the aesthetic posture that is struck at the very beginning and maintained to the end. Its movements are worked out at greater length than in the case of its predecessor, and there are formal particulars that lend themselves to that overall impression of gravitas. For instance, the second movement of this quartet is couched in sonata form and set in the work's subdominant key, while that of the G-minor quartet is set in the mediant key, the relative major, and in sonatina form, not a rubric normally associated with works of high seriousness. Moreover, Mozart even calls for repeats of both large sections in this quartet's second movement, just as he does in the opening movements of both works. And while there are close parallels between the rondo finales of both works, including the reversing of the order of thematic presentation during their respective recapitulations, this one's development section includes two new themes in important subsidiary keys. There's another parallel I want to call attention to, and it has to do with Mozart's last three symphonies, composed 2 years after this quartet in the white heat of inspiration in about 6 weeks in mid-1788. 2 of those symphonies are in the same keys as the 2 piano quartets, and in that case the G minor symphony is indeed a work of high seriousness. I want to make one more general comment before launching into the movements in turn, and it has to do with Mozart's piano writing and the demands that he makes upon the technique of those who would perform his works. Most piano trios prior to Mozart's time, and certainly all of the piano quartet writing, what little of it there was aimed at talented amateurs who enjoyed getting together and playing chamber music. Much of that music was never intended for public performance, but these 2 quartets obviously were. And it's also quite obvious that Mozart wrote the piano parts for himself. At that time, much of his public life was dedicated to playing the concertos and sonatas that he wrote for his own subscription concerts, and anyone who takes up the challenge of playing this music at the piano has awfully big shoes to fill. In this video, as in the one I posted a few days ago over the G-minor quartet, we'll hear the Beaux Arts Trio with violist Bruno Giuranna in a release by Philips. Movement 1 is a large-scale sonata form movement in the tonic key. In addition to the exposition repeat, Mozart calls for a repeat of the second large section, the development plus recap. The movement opens with some of the most self-assured music imaginable and unfolds a cornucopia of thematic invention as it moves through its primary and secondary tonal areas. Notice the broken octaves in the pianist's left hand at the beginning, and notice their return in the dominant key at the closing of the exposition, and again at the tonic level at the close of the recap. Mozart often framed his large essays in this way, writing a brief closing section that is dependent on the movement's first theme. Especially notable in this movement is the opening of the B-flat major second group, a pair of falling minor sixths, a perfect fourth apart, linked by that turning figure known as a gruppetto, a little group. This striking head motive not only saturates the theme that I have identified as 2A, it also furnishes the primary material for the entire development section as well as the brief coda that finishes the movement. It seems to me that this is both the most important and most memorable idea in Movement 1. The second movement, the larghetto, is also a sonata form movement with repeats of both large sections called for, although the second of those repeats is ignored in this performance. In fact, I've never heard this repeat observed and would really like to someday before I die. The ignoring of that second repeat actually creates a structural problem, which I will address shortly. The key of this movement is the warm subdominant, A-flat major. The thematic unfolding is deeply organic. The first theme's consequent phrase also serves as the transition, conveying the music to E-flat major, and the second theme begins harmonically off-center in C minor. This approach yields such a high degree of formal ambiguity that my parsing of the movement may seem open to question at times. This is certainly the case where the coda is concerned. This is one of those instances when a passage means one thing the first time through and a completely different thing the second time. Since the development is not repeated in this performance, the arpeggios in 32nd notes during the measure before the repeat sign are denied their bridging function, which would be apparent enough if the development were repeated as called for, and instead inaugurate the coda, one measure before the repeat sign. The identification of the coda's beginning at that point may initially seem an arbitrary judgment call on my part, but notice how great a role those arpeggios play in the remainder of the coda. If you let the passage speak to you, you may well come to the same conclusion I did. The final movement, as is the case of the G-minor piano quartet that preceded it, is in the hybrid sonata rondo form, and its themes are presented in reverse order during the recap, which reinforces the rondo aspect of that form. The second group's two appearances can then be thought of as two of the contrasting episodes in that form, with the development section furnishing another. That development is remarkable for the setting forth of two new themes, one in C minor and the other in A flat major, both obviously important related keys, whose relatedness to the tonic is easy enough to hear. The first theme, which functions also as the movement's refrain, is in gavotte rhythm, that is, its phrasing runs from mid-bar to mid-bar. This music is immensely enjoyable, and Mozart obviously thought so too. During the bridge section that brings the first return of theme 1 as the movement's refrain, the composer almost seems to be having a fit of laughter, and the image of Tom Hulse comes unbidden to my mind. One final thing to consider. Notice how often Mozart presents his themes in two statements, especially during his second groups. Also, notice how regularly the second of those statements is lengthened a little or even a lot, usually by extending the cadential area, either by reiteration or by rhythmic augmentation. This is a regular feature of this composer's approach and might almost be considered a Mozart fingerprint. There's more to say, but at this point I'm more than willing to let the music say it. Enjoy the ride.